Grady Hutchins had been watching farm auctions in Eastland County for going on 37 years by the time he saw something that made him put down his coffee and walk over to the fence line to look more carefully. He wasn't the kind of man who put down his coffee. The thing he was watching was a farmer named Voss Dempsey, who was 61 years old and driving a flatbed slowly along the south edge of the Rudder Estate dispersal, loading fence posts that nobody had bid on, and nobody was going to. It was a Saturday in late March 2013. The Rudder place sat on the west side of Eastland County off Farm Road 2228. A 340-acre operation the family had been running since the 1940s, and that 3 of the 4 Rudder children had voted to sell after their father passed in the fall of 2012. The dispersal had drawn a decent crowd for Eastland County in March. Maybe 80 people through the morning, more than that in vehicles parked along the county road. The kind of turnout that happens when a family is known and when the equipment is believed to be in reasonable shape. The cottonwoods along the stock tank were barely leafed out. The sky was pale and high, and the wind was coming from the northwest at about 15 miles an hour, steady. The kind of wind that is cold until you stop moving, and then colder. The sale had been running since 9 in the morning, and it was now past noon. Most of the crowd had moved on to the equipment lots, a John Deere 4440 with a cab that needed work, and a Massey Ferguson 240 that didn't, and those two had generated the morning's real competition. 2 brothers from Ranger had driven the 4440 up to a number that surprised people. The Massey had gone to a dealer from Abilene who hadn't said a word until the bidding slowed, and then had taken it in 3 increments. That was the morning. The fence posts were a cleanup lot. The auctioneer, a compact man named Terrell Watts, who had been running Eastland County farm sales for 19 years, hadn't even worked them through formally. He gestured at the pile near the south fence and offered them as a take-all for $15, and when nobody moved, he'd said 10. And when nobody moved again, he'd written something in his book and walked on to the next lot without looking back. Voss Dempsey had walked up after and paid the $10 and gone to get his truck. The pile he was loading was about 180 linear feet of fence posts pulled from the Rudder east and south perimeters, eastern red cedar, mostly, some of it old growth from the diameter, with a section of what looked like post oak near the bottom of the stack. The rot on the surface of the cedar was visible from the road. Some posts had split along the grain from the freeze-thaw cycles of the previous winter, which opened the wood and made the interior visible to anyone who got close enough to look. What the interior showed was sound, dense heartwood. Still dark red. Still fragrant if you got your face near the cut face. Nobody at that sale had gotten their face near the cut face. They had seen a pile of rotted fence posts, and they had walked on, which was the correct response if you knew what fence posts were for. Cedar posts in that condition couldn't be reset. The soil rot at the base end made them structurally useless. There was no fencing application for material in that state. There was, however, a charcoal application, and that was a different kind of knowledge, belonging to a different kind of person. And there was only one of that kind of person at the Rudder Estate dispersal on the last Saturday of March 2013. He was cinching a ratchet strap across the load when Earl Hutchins walked over. Earl watched him load. The posts were old eastern red cedar, pulled off the Rudder fenceland sometime before the family had started cleaning the property for sale. Some of them had been lying in the grass since the previous fall. The rot on the surface was visible from 20 feet. Several of them were split down the middle from freeze-thaw cycles, which made them look worse than they were and better than they looked, which was a thing Earl Hutchins didn't understand yet. He walked over when Voss had the last posts on the flatbed and was working a ratchet strap across the load. "Voss," Earl said. Voss looked up. He and Earl had known each other since their kids were in 4-H together, which was a long time now. "Earl," he said. He went back to the strap. Earl looked at the flatbed. He looked at the posts. He looked at Voss. "What are you going to do with those?" he said. Voss cinched the strap and looked up. He thought about it for a moment, not like the question was hard, but like he was deciding how much to say. "Make something," he said. Earl stood there for a moment. Voss climbed in the truck and pulled out of the lot. Earl walked back to his coffee, which had gone cold. He told that story for years. He told it to his son, to his brother-in-law, to a man he barely knew at a co-op meeting in Breckenridge. He told it because he had been watching farm sales for 37 years, and he knew the look of a man who saw something others didn't. And Voss Dempsey loading those posts had that look. And Earl Hutchins had walked over and asked the wrong question and gotten the right answer, and still not understood it until much later. The story he was actually watching that morning was one that had started 22 years before, in a different county, with a different man, and with a notebook that had been in a drawer for most of those years. This kind of story is the kind my father would tell on a winter evening, when the work was done and there wasn't anything else that needed doing. If yours did too, this channel is for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. Voss Dempsey grew up in Callahan County, outside Baird, the younger of two sons on a place his father Ray had bought in 1961 for $28,000 and never sold. Ray Dempsey was a careful man. Not quiet. He talked plenty, but careful in the way of men who had come up watching their fathers lose things and had decided they weren't going to do the same. He kept a ledger. He kept records of what he bought and what he paid, and what it was worth later. He kept notes in a separate notebook, a brown composition book, that he called his thinking book, which was different from the ledger, and which he kept in the right-hand drawer of his desk in the office off the kitchen. Voss had read pieces of it over the years, with permission and without. What his father wrote in the thinking book was not advice exactly. It was more like the visible surface of a long, ongoing argument Ray was having with himself about land and money and what things were actually worth versus what people said they were worth. Ray distrusted consensus. He had a phrase he used when somebody told him something was worthless. He'd say, "Worthless to who?" Ray Dempsey died in the winter of 1991. He was 68. He had been sick for about a year, and it wasn't a surprise, but it was still the kind of thing that reorganizes a life when it happens. Voss was 48 at the time, already running his own place in Eastland County, already set in his ways. He came back for the funeral and for the weeks afterward, and he took the brown composition book home with him when he left. His brother didn't want it. He didn't look at it much for the first few years. Then he started to. There were 7 pages near the middle of the book, written in 2 different pens, that had to do with charcoal. His father had written them in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when there was a small regional market for locally produced hardwood lump that had mostly dried up by the time Voss found the pages. The notes were about wood species and moisture, and a burn retort design Ray had read about in a farm journal and sketched from memory. They were also about the economics of it, feed stores, restaurant supply, the margin on local versus national brand. His father had underlined one sentence twice: "Cedar heartwood does not rot. The surface goes. The core stays." Voss read that and put the book back in the drawer. He pulled it out again in 2009, when a fence contractor he'd been using to pull old cedar off his east pasture asked him what he wanted done with the posts. The contractor usually took them to the county burn pile. Voss said to stack them behind the shop instead. He looked at the posts. He looked at the notebook. He thought about it for about 3 years. The retort he built in the winter of 2012 was not a complicated machine, though it took longer than it should have, because Voss was the kind of man who built things the way he farmed, methodically, with reference to what had been tried before and what had failed, and without cutting corners on the parts that would be hard to fix later. A 55-gallon drum inside a burn chamber made from an old propane cage he'd had behind the shop since 2004. Secondary combustion setup, a design his father had sketched in the thinking book and that Voss had studied for a week before he started building, trying to understand the principle rather than just copy the shape. 2 air intakes on the lower chamber, sized to control the burn rate. A flue pipe his son-in-law Marcus welded on a Sunday afternoon in December when the temperature was 34 degrees and the wind was making the tin on the shop roof talk. He burned the first load in January of 2013. Post oak from his own fence lane, cut and stacked the previous fall. He made 3 mistakes that his father's notes had warned him about in ways that were clear in hindsight and less clear at the time. The temperature ran too hot on the first burn and produced charcoal that was brittle. It weighed out right but broke apart when you handled it, which would draw complaints. He corrected the air intake on the second attempt and got a better result. The third mistake was a sealing issue on the drum lid that he didn't catch until the second burn told him it was there. He fixed it with furnace cement and a piece of angle iron and didn't have the problem again. The first good burn produced 19 pounds of finished charcoal. He weighed it on the postal scale his wife Ruth kept in the laundry room for mailing packages, the same scale she'd used for 30 years and that registered accurate to the half ounce. He wrote 19. 3 lbs in the brown composition book, and the date, and the wood species, and the burn time, and the ambient temperature outside, which was 41 degrees, because he didn't yet know which of those variables mattered, and which didn't, and he wasn't willing to guess. He bagged it in paper grocery sacks, 6 of them, the big ones from the supermarket in Eastland, and drove to Clyde Co-op and Feed in Callahan County, his father's county. The place Ray Dempsey had bought feed and seed and fence supplies for 30 years, where people still remembered him, where Voss had driven as a boy in the passenger seat of his father's pickup and watched his father talk to people and noticed that his father always listened more than he spoke. The manager's name was Barry Odom. He was 43 years old and had been running that co-op for 9 years. His commercial charcoal supplier, a distributor out of Lubbock, had been delivering inconsistent product for the better part of 2 years, and Barry had a habit of testing each new shipment by weight and density before he put it on the floor, which was not a habit most feed store managers had, but which Barry had developed after the 3rd complaint from a customer who'd bought a bag and found half of it was dust. He had a standing low-level irritation about this situation that he shared with Voss in about 4 minutes, while Voss stood at the counter with his grocery bags and waited for it to finish. Then Barry looked at the bags. He opened one and pulled out a piece of the cedar lump and turned it over in both hands the way a man handles something he's been missing without knowing the name for it. He tapped it on the counter edge, a solid sound, not hollow. He held it up. He smelled it. He was quiet for a moment. He opened the second bag and pulled out a piece of the post oak blend from the bottom and did it again. He set both pieces on the counter and looked at them. He looked at Voss. "What are you asking?" he said. Voss said $2, 50 a pound. Barry nodded once, like a man confirming something he'd already figured out. He said he'd take the 19 pounds and to bring more when Voss had it. He did not say if it moved. He said when Voss had it. That was a different sentence, and Voss heard the difference. Voss was 61 years old. He had been farming in Eastland County for 32 years. He had never sold charcoal before, and he had never expected to. He drove home on Farm Road 2228 with $47.50 in his jacket pocket, 19 pounds at $2.50 a pound. And he thought about his father the whole way. That was the spring of 2013. By fall, he was running 2 burns a month out of the machine shed on the Eastland County place, sourcing wood from his own fence posts and from estate sales in Eastland, Callahan, and Shackelford counties. He developed a system for the sales the same way he'd developed systems for everything else he'd done in 40 years of farming, quietly, without announcing it, until it was working. He knew which auctioneers ran cleanup lots as a formal bid, and which ones offered them informally at the end. He knew which families in the county had been on the land long enough to have old-growth cedar on the perimeters. He paid an average of $11 for a load. He never paid more than $20. Barry Odom called in November to say the first sale had cleared in 12 days and he wanted a regular delivery schedule. He wanted to know if Voss had enough raw material. Voss said he thought he could find some. This was not quite true yet, but he knew where to look, and he knew how to look. And by the time the spring sale started in 2014, it was true enough. He found wood at the Rudder Dispersal in late March of 2013, which was where Earl Hutchins watched him load the flatbed and asked what he was going to do with the posts, and got an answer that took him several years to fully understand. He found it at a Callahan County dispersal in June. He found it at 3 more sales before the year was out, each time paying between $8 and $14 for material that other people had passed over without stopping. He began to be recognized at sales. Not as the man who made charcoal, most people didn't know that yet, but as the man who took the fence posts. A couple of auctioneers started setting cleanup lots aside for him informally, calling the week before a sale. Terrell Watts, who had been the auctioneer at the Rudder Dispersal, called in August of 2014 about a Johnson County estate that was going up in September and had what he described as a considerable amount of old cedar in good condition. He said he thought Voss might want to know. Voss went. He paid $17 for the lot. It was worth it. By 2016, he was selling to 4 feed stores across 3 counties and had added 2 accounts with a barbecue restaurant group out of Abilene that ran 3 locations and went through 80 to 100 pounds of lump a week across the group. The cedar blend, some post oak in for depth, the ratio varying by batch and by what the wood gave him, had developed a following among the pitmasters that Voss didn't seek out and didn't discourage. Not famous, just known to the people who knew. He built a second retort in 2017. Same design as the first, different dimensions, built by his son-in-law Marcus, who had been welding for 12 years by then and had gotten considerably better. The second unit ran cleaner and produced a more consistent burn. Voss noted the differences in a brown composition book he had bought at a stationery store in Abilene in the spring of 2013 and used for the charcoal operation the way his father had used the thinking book, not as a ledger, but as a record of what he was learning, written to be read again later when later arrived. He charged $2.50 a pound for 6 years, from the first sale to Barry Odom in the spring of 2013 until the spring of 2019. Then he raised it to $2.75. He considered that raise for 3 months before he made it. He raised it again to $3 in the fall of 2022. He considered that one for 6 weeks. Both times the accounts stayed. Nobody left. 2 of them said it was past time. Ruth Dempsey died in the spring of 2021. She had been sick for about 2 years, and it wasn't a surprise. And it was still the thing that reorganizes a life when it happens. Voss kept running burns through that spring. He didn't think much about stopping. He thought about stopping once, in June, standing at the retort, with the fire drawn down and the drum cooling, and nobody else around. And then he didn't think about it again. Earl Grady Hutchins retired from active farming in 2019 and moved to a smaller place outside Cisco in Eastland County. He still attends estate sales. He buys Voss Dempsey's charcoal from the co-op in Clyde when he can get it, which is not always, because it sells faster than it used to. He told me he wished he'd asked a better question that morning. He didn't say what question he'd have asked instead. He said he wasn't sure he would have understood the answer, even if he had. Voss Dempsey is 72 now. He runs one burn a week, weather permitting, in the machine shed on the Eastland County property he has farmed since 1981. He sources most of his wood from fence contractors who call him. He still goes to estate sales when there's something worth going for. His price is $3, $10 a pound, and he will not be talked below it. His father's brown composition book is in the right-hand drawer of the desk in the office off the kitchen. Voss's brown composition book is on top of the desk. Different book. Same drawer would have been right. But the desk only has the one. Ray Dempsey understood something that took his son 22 years to act on, and will probably take the rest of us longer than that. That the thing nobody wants is almost never worthless. It is usually just waiting for the person who knows what it is. The worthless cedar post and the good cedar post are the same post. The only difference is who is standing in front of it. Worthless to who? That was the question. It always was.